looking at workflow and process and automation, as well as the analytic apps, thinking maybe like Power BI or grabbing data to do your own analytics. And again, that graph sits on top of the M365 workload, which is going to be Office 365, Windows 10, and Enterprise Mobility and Security. And as you see, we've got the ability to sort of extend out and reach and connect with data sitting in Azure and sort of AI platform, right? As well as, thinking about that identity as a sort of a single service across the whole platform. Now, when you access the Microsoft Graph, you're going to use the Graph REST API, right? You're going to use that platform, the framework, the programming languages that you're most comfortable with to basically make HTTP requests and then process those responses. We do have some Graph native SDKs for a variety of platforms, Android, Angular, let's see, what else was it? ASP.NET, we've got iOS support, JavaScript, Node, Java, PHP, Python, Ruby, and I think one or two others. So if you do support any of those languages, it's a great way to sort of just take advantage of the existing SDK to simplify your development and workflow. Again, from the authentication options, Azure AD accounts, M365 and O365 resources, as well as the Microsoft accounts. So thinking of it more as a consumer resource scenario. Now, one way to work with the Graph API itself and begin to test and explore is to leverage the Graph Explorer. Here, you're going to be able to use a web interface to sort of submit the command. So Graph, you'll see we've got the URL, got the ability to put the various parameters there, like version, resource, and the query parameters. And you'll get your standard status code, your response message, and then the next link for when you're doing paging situations. Now, there's a lot of data sitting in Office 365, and potentially, your ability to work with that data could be overwhelming in some respects to your application, to the devices that you're sitting on. So you definitely want to consider optimizing your data usage with query parameters, limiting the results that you get back to a very focused and specific set of data instead of trying to just grab it all and do local processing. So inside of the Graph API, right, we're leveraging many of the OData protocol query parameters. So things like order results, limit number of results, do search resources, select specific data properties, as well as filtering data. So here you'll see we've got, a standard select query. You're going to typically use this when you only want to fetch sort of the required fields and to get properties that are typically not returned by default. Now, here as an example of a request where you're doing the from and the subject properties of a signed in user and you're searching their messages. You've got the order by capability. And this is great where you can be much more efficient, leverage the server to sort of pre-sort and produce the results to you. Definitely more efficient than trying to do it on the client side. And here's an example of where you're going to fetch users in the organization and then order it by their display name. A couple other query parameters that you can consider too, using the top query parameter to specify the page size of the result set you're going to bring back. You can also use the skip query parameter, maybe to sort of skip past a certain section of a collection. You do have the expand parameter. Here you're going to fetch additional resources related to the request. You're going to typically provide a comma-separated list of properties that can be expanded and included in your search results. And here's an example where you're going to fetch the root drive information along with the top-level child items inside of a OneDrive. You can also get a count back. So here's the ability to add the count parameter, and you put the $count equals true as part of your query string. And what you'll get back is a count. In addition to the results, you also get a count of those items as well. And here's an example where you're going to fetch contact information for the current user and then bring back as well the number of contacts that person has. You also have the ability to do a search query. Here in this example, you'll use the search query to restrict the results to a specific match based on your query. It does support keyword query language, so thinking of it as structured queries that allow you to target searches to specific fields. And then you can search messages and person collections as an example. So here you're searching on messages, maybe from the subject of the body. Maybe you're searching on people by the display name or their email address. And an example here, we've fetched messages in the signed in user's mailbox, that contain pizza and are in the from, subject, or the body. There's also a filter query parameter. Here you're going to be able to go in and sort of filter down the information to a very specific set. So typically this is when you want to find resources that match a specific query. You'll use this to retrieve just a subset of a collection. And obviously we support various operators across the Graph APIs. So here's an example where you're going to fetch all unread email in the signed in user's mailbox using the equals logic operator. So let's go ahead and pull up the Graph API and take a look at the Explorer. All right, so let's open up a browser and let's go to graph.explorer.com. Sorry, graph.microsoft.com. And in graph.microsoft.com, let's go to Graph Explorer. And there you go. A couple things to note real quick. You'll see we've got a sign in button. If you select sign in, what you'll do is you'll allow access into your data. So anything that you're going to query here will be things that are happening against your account and potentially your tenant. Otherwise, what you'll get is sort of standard dummy data. And what we're going to focus in on in this exercise is basically using query parameters when querying the Microsoft Graph via HTTP. And we'll do some work on filter, select, order by, expanding, count, and search. And we're going to use the Graph Explorer to sort of submit the queries to the Graph API and then get the results down in the response window and sort of look at how we can manipulate and sort of filter down and reduce the volume of information that's coming down. All right. So let's go start with our first query. All right, so our first query, what we want to do is we want to replace me with groups. Let's do a search for groups across this particular tenant. Now, as you can see, let's take a look at our response headers. We have a content length of 11,895. So there's a fair amount of data that's sitting in this particular query. And as you can see, we scroll through, just lots and lots of data to take a look at. That might be too much, right, depending on the organization. So what we could do is actually filter that down a little bit. So if we make a few additional enhancements, and here in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to add some query parameters to the end of the group line. So what we're going to do is add a question mark and select display name, mail, and visibility. So now we're going to submit that query. And what you'll notice is that the results that have been returned now have been limited to only display name, mail, and visibility. We've removed all of the other noise out of that query result, right? And this way we can be much more focused in the data we get back and how we're going to manage that data. Now, one thing to keep in mind too, especially when you're doing a lot of work programmatically, is that one thing you'll notice in the data results that we've got display name, mail, and visibility, but there's no unique identifier. I mean, in some cases, maybe mail could end up being the unique identifier, but wouldn't it be great if you could do an ID or a GUID? So one thing we can add to this parameter, to this query, is an ID field. So let's run that query, and there we go. So now we've got a nice ID field, so we know that that record is unique. It just in case the mail or other fields are duplicated somewhere else. All right, so we've added in some filters. We've got information coming back. Wouldn't it be great if we could maybe order it and have it come back to us in alphabetical order? So one of the things we can add is the ability to add an order by. So we do there, order by equals, and let's maybe order by display name. And let's submit that query. And there we go. We've received our results back, starting alphabetical. And if we change that and we add a descending, as you can see, we can obviously flip and reverse the order of that query. So real quick, nice, easy way to get data back sorted without having to do anything from a local processing perspective. All right, so let's switch over to doing a filter query. And let's do something that's got a lot of content. Let's switch over to messages for a minute. So if we go into my messages in this account and I run the query, what you're going to notice is a lot of data gets returned. Now, maybe we want to filter that down a little bit. So what if we did something like adding a filter that has emails only with attachments equals true. All right, so what we've got here is the same message, but now we're going to filter it to only those that have attachments. And we can even filter that down further, or we can even change the filters. So let's do this. Let's change that one around. We're going to grab messages that come from an email address that is equal to no reply at Microsoft.com. And I've got a typo somewhere. Hold on. All right, let's type it in manually and see what we get here. All right, there we go. All right, there we go. I had a typo with the quotation marks. And there we go. So as you see, we've now filtered down to emails that just came from no reply at Microsoft.com. Let's try changing the query. And this one, what we're going to do is we're going to filter for emails that start with the subject of my. So let's see what we get back here. All right, there we go. Had an issue with the quotes again. Gotta fix that in my copy and paste here. But again, as you can see, we've filtered down to just emails, messages that start with the subject of my. All right, let's take advantage of the skip and the top filters. So let's make a modification here. Let's go and let's do events. All right, so there we go. So we just queried the graph. We searched for my events, and here's a list of my events. Now what we want to do is maybe let's add some filters to that. So let's do, how about the top 5? So $top equals 5, and let's run that query. And there you go. As you can see, as we scroll down, we will only have 5 responses that match that query. Now let's go through a little bit about expanding your and retrieving resources using the expand parameter. So let me just grab a query here. Let's try this one. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to go search for messages. Those messages have attachments because it's equal to true. So let's run that first. And we've got the OData context message, which means there's probably quite a few messages. So let's take a look. How can we filter a bit better? So let's use the expand command. So let's go ahead and modify this link, this URL. All right, so what we're doing here is we're putting a filter again with the attachments, but we're adding on the expand command. All right, it might be that this particular account does not have attachments, so let's try this. Let's go false and run the query. There we go. So we've gone and modified the query a little bit because in this case we didn't have any attachments or emails with attachments. And so there we go. So then we've got the expand capability as on top of that. All right, let's try using the count command now. So let's come back here. Let's make a modification. Let's just do my messages, and let's just get a count alongside those messages. And there we go. So what you can see here is we've got 273 messages based on our query, and of course, all the associated data. We can also take advantage of the search query. So let's replace our URL. Let's make a few changes here. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to search our messages using the search query for the word business. And our quotes are wrong in our document. So let's fix that. All right, so this particular account does not have business in it. So let's do, um, let's do addition. Let's see what we've got there. All right, let's try that query. And there we go. So we've got some data in here, and it looks like it picked up on the subject. So collaboration addition emails coming in from my analytics. So we've got obviously quite a few because that comes in typically once a day. So if there's other filters or criteria, obviously I can add on top of that. But it's a good way if you need to search across these emails looking for some keywords, you can just take advantage of the search queries. So again, Graph API, this Graph Explorer is really great in sort of giving you an opportunity to test and just run some example queries. There are some quick starts here if you wanted to find maybe your manager. You can simply come in, click on the example, it'll format the URL for you. And in my demo account, this is my manager. And as you can see, there's a wealth of example templates looking for something in Microsoft Teams. Maybe you want to try doing a post, posting messages into a channel, maybe sending a channel message. Right? You also have the availability of the various beta commands. So if you're looking to do something that's not yet available in the general public, you can go and use the beta commands here. So here's the ability to throw a message in a channel, get presence, status, etc. And as you can see, lots of options and continually adding more and more features and capabilities of the Graph API. All right, so let's switch back to our slides. Let's get into a discussion around optimizing sort of the network traffic. So with that, one of the things you can do is receive change notifications. So when you're building your applications, there are times where you want it to respond to changes that are happening with data that may be sitting inside of the Microsoft Graph. So what you can do is you can subscribe to those changes on the various supported resources. Your client will receive notifications to the URL you provided when you do the subscription, and then it'll basically send a 202 response to provide an acknowledgement of that receipt. So you've obviously got the ability to sort of validate the client state property, and then of course update your application based on the business logic from that notification. So it's a really great way to kind of stay connected and deal with more real-time notifications and updates. You also have the ability to do some batch querying. So here, if you use the batch parameter, you can combine multiple graph requests into a single HTTP request, right? And then at the end of the day, that's going to help you reduce the number of JSON calls that you need to make, or HTTP calls, and you'll create a JSON array basically. It'll allow you to post that information in that batch query. Make sure to use the depends on to specify dependencies between the request and the batch, just to make sure that your information comes correctly. You can also use the get changes using the Delta query. It's a very efficient way to pull sort of the Microsoft Graph for changes to sets of data. So you'll think about making a get request with the full delta function of that resource, and then the graph response will include the next link in the URL. So if there's additional pages, or if there's a delta link, you basically can query that specific link and fetch that additional data. For future requests, use the Delta link URL, right, to be able to retrieve those changes. And then there's the optional query parameters, which must be set to specified for that initial request. And then they'll be encoded in the next link in the Delta link tokens. Now, one important thing to remember is you need to think about how you want to handle throttling. So throttling will happen at various points. It is going to try to limit the number of concurrent calls to the service, right? Obviously to prevent overuse of the resources, keep it balanced for everybody across the Microsoft 365. Now, when throttling occurs, Graph's going to return back a HTTP status code of 429, and that request will fail. So what you need to do is monitor and look at the retry after header and basically wait the number of seconds specified in that header information. And at that point, once you've hit that threshold of the retry after, then you can retry your request. So it's definitely best practice. You need to look for those 429 messages. And at that point, grab the retry after, and then begin to set up your code to then do that retry after that period of time. Definitely best practice to make sure you don't have any issues with your data or accessing the Graph API. All right, so let's get into a quick demo on reducing traffic with those batched requests. All right, so let's pull up the Graph Explorer again. Let me grab my browser. Perfect. All right, let's go back into the Graph Explorer. And what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and run a query. Let's get back a list of users in our organization. So let me change this up here. To users. And let's run that query. So as you can see, we've got back quite a few lines. Again, all of our users in the organization. All right, so let's do this. Let's copy the ID for Adele. Let's go to Alex. Where's Adele? Here's Adele. Let's grab Adele's ID. And let's run a query just for Adele. So we're going to come in here and go /users/ and then let's put Adele's unique identifier. And as you can see, you now have been returned with just Adele. Now, what if we wanted to get the photo of just Adele? What we can do is extend or enhance this particular query. And so now we've got users, Adele. Now let's add photo. And there's the URL for our user Adele. Maybe we want to change that and we want to get Adele's manager. So let's replace that photo with manager. And there we go. And now we're able to identify Adele's manager just by simply changing the query at the end. So, this was just a quick way to take a look at some of the various components. When in this exercise, right, we sort of talked a little bit about looking at the signed-in user's profile. We got a list of users in the organization, user profile, and then grab some various objects specific to that user, like in this case, their photo, grab their phone number, we could have grabbed their manager, etc. So just a quick way to go through that. So let's go back to those slides. All right, let's see here. Let's get back to slides. Perfect. All right, so let's do this. Let's talk about accessing user data with the Microsoft Graph. All right, again, you're going to sort of work with the users in the graph. You're going to access and manipulate those user resources, right? You shouldn't have to perform additional calls and look up specific authentication information, right? You're going to be able to do those queries directly against the graph and those resources. So like when you're accessing users through the graph, again, it's user, their ID, principal name, or if it's yourself, obviously the /me. Here's a way to also get some additional information about users. You can get a list of users in the organization, you can get their profiles and their photo profiles, grab additional metadata, maybe about the profile photo, and again, grabbing their manager information. So it's just a couple examples there. All right, So, final section, let's talk a little bit about accessing files with the Microsoft Graph. So when you're working with files in the Microsoft Graph, right, the graph is going to expose two resource types for you when you're working with files. There'll be the drive resource and then the drive item resource. Right? The drive and the drive item resources are going to be exposed in a couple different ways. So there's the properties that expose the simple values, the facets around those values, and then obviously the reference points to the collections of other resources. So when you think about it, like if you think about a drive, right? So that's sort of the top level container for the file system. And that's where you're going to think about things like OneDrive and SharePoint document libraries. And here you've got the ability to leverage the Graph API to retrieve properties, relationships of that information inside of that drive. So here we've got get information about a drive. You'll see the get command, me, as well as the get users command. You can get a list of items inside of the drive. So you can go me, drive, root, and children, as well as get the list of trending items around a signed in user. And so here you can see me, drive, and then recent as would be your get query there, and that'll show you your most recent files. Now, you can also download those files. And so one way to do that is to sort of grab that content from a stream of the drive item. So only drive items with the file property can be downloaded. So what you need to do is make the HTTP request it come in as me drive items, that item ID, and then /content. And that'll give you the opportunity to download that file. And if you need to upload a large file, you're going to upload it with one of two ways. So you're going to create that upload and create an upload session. And then you can basically upload the bytes to that upload session. And you'll see here in your post command, you're going to go to the root with the item path, and then you'll create the upload session for that. Now, there may be times where you need to get a user object from an owner list in a group, and then use that as a way to go in and retrieve files related to that user. So here you've got the opportunity to enumerate the owners of the group and to get their user ID. You'll then grant the appropriate permissions to that list of owners, right, to be able to see that information. You'll get the user's drive ID. Then with the drive ID, you'll have the ability to then go list the items in that user's drive and sort of return back that information and get that back in a response. All right, and in today's final session, what we want to just chat about real quick is managing a group lifecycle on the Microsoft Graph. Now, when you're working with groups in the graph, right, the graph is really, or the group is a resource within the graph that represents kind of a combination of things. Um, there are going to be types of groups accessible in the graph. You'll have two common types, Office 365 groups, which we just renamed Microsoft 365 groups, as well as security groups. Now, when you want to get information about those groups, you're going to basically go, do a list command, specify specific groups. You're going to use the Graph API or multiple Graph SDKs to go in and grab information. So here's an example where you can use the groups. So graph Microsoft.com, and then the group, and then, or if you know the group ID, you can take advantage of the group ID. Here's a listing of the information from Get Group Information. So here's a way to get group owners, get group members, get the list of groups where a user is an owner, and get the list of groups where a user is a member. And there's just some additional queries to take a look at. You also have the ability to manage groups. So there are times where you may need to create a group, create a team that goes with a group, or even potentially delete a group. A couple things to remember about deleting groups. You can restore them up to 30 days. After that time, that group is permanently deleted. Of course, there are things in the back end like retention policies that you'll need to consider as far as the overall structure, but typically they're deleted within 30 days. This concludes part one. Let's recap what we've covered so far. So we were able to dive into the Microsoft identity, covering authentication and authorization. We've also gone into the Microsoft Graph, again, our REST-based endpoint that allows you as a developer access to a rich set of capabilities and data across the Microsoft 365 platform. So thank you for your attendance so far today, and we look forward to seeing you next time for part 2 of the Microsoft 365 Virtual Training Days, Building Microsoft Teams, Integrations, and Workflows.